Were a man to walk from one side of the pass to the other upon the heads of orcs, he could do so without once setting foot on rock. Sigmar smiled at the absurdity of the image, and the spell that the orc numbers had upon him was broken. Welcome everybody to the second episode of the Old World Chronicles, a Warhammer the Old World Lore podcast. My name is Lewis, and I will be your humble guide as we explore the world of legend together. Before we go on, please subscribe to the YouTube channel or podcast feed and share it with your friends if you enjoy the episode. If you are watching on YouTube, please like the video and add any comments that you have below. We really appreciate your support, and any engagement helps us please the mightiest god in all of the old world, the algorithm. And if you have any suggestions for topics you'd like to see covered in the series, please comment below and I'll take these on board. So in today's episode, we are going to be exploring one of the most famous battles in all of the old world's history, going right back to 1 BIC. Now, this is the titanic clash at Blackfire Pass between the human and dwarf forces of Sigmar Heldenhammer and Kurgan Ironbeard, and the orc and goblin tribes led by the war boss Urgluk Bloodfang. Now, this is a battle that I think probably every single one of you listening to this will have at least heard of, even if you're not intimately familiar with. So I hope I do it justice. We're going to start by learning about our cast of characters that took part in the battle, before looking at the terrain of Blackfire Pass itself, the forces that were arrayed against each other, and then we'll go through the events of the battle itself. I'm going to save the impact of the battle on the factions involved for another episode, but it's pretty safe to say this is a truly seismic event in the timeline of the old world. So settle in, relax, and enjoy another old world chronicle. So the scale of the battle for Blackfire Pass inevitably means that I could recount stories of glorious and heroic deeds that could fill 10 hours of Old World Chronicles episodes. So I'm going to have to start by narrowing things down somewhat. So I apologise therefore to those of you who are big fans of the drug-fuelled Thuringian berserker woman Ulfdar, who fights for most of the day with a broken arm, and to fans of the heroic hunting hounds of King Marcus battling the giant wolves trying to eat their master, and even those who love the weird prophecies of the hag woman of the Brackenwalsh that seem to hang over a number of characters in and around this battle. These tales are great, but they are going to need to be told another day as we focus in on the most critical players in this story. First up, and obviously, we have to start with our lead character, Sigmar Heldenhammer himself. At the time of the battle, Sigmar is simply the king of a human tribe known as the Unberogen. This tribe is flourishing under his rule and is based out of what is now modern-day Reikland. Sigmar enters this battle fresh off his quest to unite the willing tribes of men to his cause and begins the process of forging the modern-day empire. He's dreamed of a day where the lands of men west of the World's Edge Mountains are united in common purpose. A day where the bickering or warring tribes come together and stand as one against the myriad foes that beset them. He is simply the most gifted statesman and warrior the tribes of men have seen in generations. And because of this, he's mostly successful in this quest. Just in a nick of time too. 12 tribes are united in time for this battle. And without Sigmar's previous efforts to create this unity, the battle would most certainly have been lost, and the lands we know now as the Empire completely overrun by greenskins. Sigmar, of course, enters the battle wielding his dwarf-forged warhammer, Gal Maraz. It's worth noting here that Sigmar does try to bring in the tribes of the Bretonni into this alliance, but they steadfastly refuse. Now, if you want to hear more about what happens to the Bretonni after refusing Sigmar's offer of allegiance, you can go back to our first episode of the Old World Chronicles, where we discuss none other than Gilles le Breton. So, moving on, 3 of the tribal kings and queens in Sigmar's newly formed alliance of men play key roles in the Battle of Blackfire Pass. So I'm going to draw these out now. Do keep in mind, nearly all of the kings and queens from the Alliance are present at the battle, they just play slightly less central roles. First up, I'd like to introduce you to Otwin, the Berserker King of the Thuringians. King Otwin is described as being a true giant of a man, large even for the people of the Thuringian tribe. As a Berserker King, he fights almost completely naked, and his body is covered in tattoos and piercings. His crown, actually, that he wears on his head has spikes within it which dig into his temple, causing him pretty intense pain and firing up that berserker rage that he and his tribe are famous for. Quite similar to the nails in the World Eaters, for those of you that follow 40k. He wields a monstrous double-headed axe, again World Eater style, that he actually chains to his wrist. Now, to convince Otwin to join Sigmar's burgeoning empire, Sigmar was forced to give battle to the Thuringians. He personally defeated Otwin in combat by using Galmaraz to break the chains of Otwin's axe, and then strangling him almost to the point of death. At which point, the berserker rage faded, so Otwin could be reasoned with. Now, that's an epic fight in and of itself, worth another chronicle all of its own. But I thought I'd leave Otwin with an extract of the words said between the two kings at this moment that have travelled down to us over the years. Quote, "It is over, King Otwin. You have a choice now, live or die. Swear your sword oath with me, and together we will build an empire of men to hold back the darkness. And if I refuse, then I will drive you and your people from the land. Your villages will burn, your heirs will die, and the lamentation of your women shall be unending. That is not much of a choice." End quote. Next up, Queen Freya. Now, leaving the fantasy world for just a moment, Queen Freya feels like a character written in a slightly different cultural time period than today. She's clearly an incredibly powerful woman, but in the stories, this is all kind of wrapped up in kind of tales of her sexual contests and lots of hedonism that don't come quite across as well in the 21st century, which I guess is 1980s Games Workshop for you, I suppose. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about her history, but safe to say that Freya is the queen of the Azerborn tribe. Now, hers is a tribe which specialises in the art of chariot warfare. Freya and her nearly all female warriors fight on the back of chariots pulled by, and as a result of Sigmar's offer of alliance, Unberagan stallions. Queen Freya's warriors are able to accurately use missile weapons like bows and javelins at speed, and they have truly incredible handling capabilities of their vehicles, even in the midst of battle. This makes them incredibly dangerous shock troops, as we'll see in the coming battle. The last of the human tribal monarchs I want to highlight is King Marbad of the Endels tribe. Marbad and the Endels have been long-time allies of the Unberagan tribe, ever since Sigmar's father Bjorn rode to them in their time of need. King Marbad wields a particularly rare and deadly magical elven sword known as Ulfshard. Now, it's worth noting at this time in the history of the old world, the tribes of men, they know about magic, but they don't know huge amounts of it, and they don't use it regularly in their society. Now, there are magical beings and magical items present, obviously Galmaraz, the hammer, definitely being one of them, but they're not very well understood and they're broadly mistrusted. Seers, like the hagwoman of the Brackenwalsh that we spoke about before, are almost universally feared, derided, and even ostracised from society. We know, however, that Ulfshard is used willingly by King Marbad and is thought to have been a demon-slaying sword forged by the elves in the ancient histories. It's actually one of the only weapons in the Endels armoury capable of slaying the infamous mist demons which regularly plague their lands. I think that's enough about the humans, so time to move on to our dwarven characters. Two characters really shine through in this story. We first up have Kurgan Ironbeard and Runemaster Alaric. Kurgan Ironbeard is the High King of the Dwarves, ruling out of Karaz-a-Karak in the World's Edge Mountains. Kurgan really sits behind a lot of Sigmar's early success at uniting the tribes of men. And this is all because Sigmar actually managed to arrive precisely at the exact time needed to save Kurgan from being tortured and killed by a group of greenskins about 15 years before the battle. And ever since then, Kurgan has vowed to support the lands of the men. He gifted Sigmar Galmaraz, although actually he reports that Galmaraz chose Sigmar rather than him wanting to give away his finest warhammer. And Kurgan instigates significant trade ties between the dwarven mountain holds and the tribes of men. Now, this trade helps the tribes grow and prosper in times of plenty, rather than having to scrap for survival. Kurgan Ironbeard actually, a few weeks and months before this battle, tells the story of the moment that Galmaraz chose Sigmar as follows. Quote, "I hold out, Galmaraz, and I'm ready to charge into battle, even though I'm fit to drop with pain and exhaustion. But a dwarf never lies down when there's battle to be done, unless he's dead. And even then, he'd better be really, really dead, or his ancestors will be having words with him when he gets to the other side." But even as I lifted the warhammer, I knew it wasn't for me to carry into battle. You see, the power in Galmaraz is ancient, even to us dwarves, and it knows who is supposed to bear it. Truth be told, I think it's always been your warhammer, Sigmar, even before you were born. I think it was waiting for you. Down the long, lonely centuries, it was waiting for the moment you'd be ready to wield it. End quote. Our other dwarf character at the battle is Runemaster Alaric. He is the runesmith of Kirazikarak and also an envoy between the dwarves and the Umberogan tribe. He teaches humans many secrets of manufacture, farming and smithing. This actually upgrades their armour and weapons to better compete with Frostive the orcs, and ensures the humans are significantly more productive in their labour. Alaric doesn't come up a huge amount in the battle himself, but he's absolutely critical in the aftermath, so I did want to mention him here, although you won't necessarily hear about him from now until the end. So finally, this story wouldn't be complete without introducing our foil, the orc warlord himself, Urgluk Bloodfang. Prior to the arrival of Urgluk on the scene, the orc and goblins tribes had never united in a way that would prove an existential threat to the tribes of men. An era of safety I'm sure many modern emperors would long for. Urgluk Bloodfang is the head of the Bloodfang tribe, and by forcing a myriad of other tribes to come together, mostly by crushing skulls and shouting a lot, forms the first ever recorded Orc Waaagh. Now actually, it's an interesting parallel to observe here between Urgluk and Sigmar. They're both sitting there, either side of the mountains, dreaming of bigger things, and slowly gathering followers to their cause. That Sigmar calls his an empire, and Urgluk calls his a waaagh, doesn't really seem that different when you stand them side by side. Some historians have theorised that really Sigmar could not have brought the human tribes together without Urgluk. The tribal kings needed a truly existential threat to band together and allow Sigmar to lead them into that pass. So I guess we've got Urgluk to thank for this. Edrin Thorinson, dwarf historian of the Carrick Eight Peaks, sums this up nicely. Quote, "It is my firm belief that the Empire would never have been founded by Sigmar Heldenhammer if not for the great threat known as Urgluk Bloodfang that presented itself in the realms of men. More than a dozen tribes of men squabbled over the forests, plains and mires west of the World's Edge Mountains. These tribes were led by kings and queens in name only. For what power did these primitive tribes wield? While these monarchs of men ruled over mud and stick huts, the Dowie had had massive holds carved of sturdy stone, with the fine craftsmanship of the Dowie on display. In that fateful time, the cursed orcs of the south marched upon the lands of men, and through sheer fear united them. It must have been quite an odd spectacle for our ancestors to witness. Men and orcs, both clad in blue paint on their naked bodies, with bones in their hair and a wild craze in their eyes, clashed. Never before in history had so much colour erupted in Hasdraz Kadrin, or Blackfire Pass, as the victor would have it." End quote. So, on to Blackfire Pass itself then. The Blackfire Pass forms a part of the Old Dwarf Road and Silver Road network. It runs through the World's Edge Mountains from the lands we now know as the Empire in the west and the Badlands to the east. The mountains themselves are home to a large number of dwarf holds with access to the pass, and therefore the pass is a strategically significant trade and transport route throughout the Dwarven Kingdom. It's really the only safe, in inverted commas, way through this stretch of the World's Edge Mountains. Prior to the battle itself, the pass was traditionally defended by the dwarves, which by extension prevented the worst of the greenskin menace from ever actually reaching the human lands. However, prior to the battle, a number of the greenskins amassing on the far side of the pass meant that the dwarves needed to retreat to defend their mountain holds and could no longer hold back the tide. They sent word to Sigmar that Urgluk was coming and that the size of this invasion eclipsed anything he would have seen before. So, knowing that the orcs were likely to simply attack headlong wherever they found the armies of men, Sigmar quite cleverly chose the point within Blackfire Pass that the battle would be fought over, the point that favoured him the most and allowed him to gather his army there. He chooses the narrowest part of the pass, right in front of an old ruined dwarf watchtower known as the Eagle's Nest. This part of Blackfire Pass is less than 2 miles wide and is where the pass is bordered by pretty immense vertical cliffs which kind of slope up to form the peaks of the World's Edge Mountains. It's really quite intelligent, as obviously it allows the allied forces to fight knowing that they are unlikely to be outflanked in any kind of serious number, and therefore restricts the value of the numerical advantage the orcs and goblins are likely to hold over them. Now, also in this location, the topography of the pass slopes to the east and away from the army of the allies, and it's not a dramatic slope, but it does mean that the orcs and goblins are needing to effectively fight the entire battle uphill, which again further evens the scales in the favour of Sigmar. Directly in front of where Sigmar lines up his forces, the plain is relatively open and free of major obstructions, which makes it a perfect place for the Unberogan cavalry and the Azerborn charioteers to operate. Now, there are actually a series of kind of large rock formations and boulders scattered right where Sigmar deploys his army. Now, these again, they help to kind of narrow the pass in specific locations, further reducing the numerical advantage of the orcs, and also helping to reduce the risk of an orc breakthrough leading to units being flanked immediately or one half of the army being completely cut off, which should hopefully buy time for reserve forces to step in. In terms of deployment, Sigmar lines up his forces of men and dwarves in a fairly traditional manner. He deploys his heaviest and most reliable infantry to hold the centre. Now, these are King Kurgan's dwarves, the Unberogan line infantry, and the kilted Udozi warriors. On his left flank, Sigmar deploys the Endel, the Ostergoth, and the Cherussan infantry. And on the right, he places the Burgundian, the Merogan, and the Menegoth infantry. The archers and catapults of the Cherussan and the Unberogan deploy behind the lines, ready to volley fire over their allies. The Thuringian Berserkers, King Otwin's group, Sigmar, I think, knew in advance of the battle he was really going to be unable to control those warriors, especially once the drugs started taking effect and the bloodlust kicked in. So the idea of having that group of warriors form a part of a formal battle line just isn't really going to work. So he raised them in front of the main lines of his troops, and really they're there just to get stuck into the kind of early part of the orc forces. Sigmar does line his cavalry up in front of the infantry to start with to support those berserkers, and his cavalry in this battle mostly wield the heavy lances, which actually is the first recorded use of couched lances in the Empire. The Azerborn chariots, Queen Freya's lot, they're also roaming around in front of the infantry for exactly the same reason. They're to support the berserkers and hopefully not lose that force so quickly in the battle. On the flanks, there is the ability to get some light skirmishing infantry and light cavalry up onto the sloping valley sides and up into some of the cliffs. Now, clearly, the topography means that Sigmar's not really expecting significant attempts by the Greenskins to outflank his forces. The terrain just makes that far too challenging to do en masse. But he did need to put some forces up on the valley sides to try and deter any of the more kind of the cunning goblin kind from braving a route behind the Allies' lines. Now, across the field, looking at the deployment of Urglok Bloodfang's horde, and you will potentially be unsurprised to hear it doesn't quite have the same structure to it as Sigmar's forces. As we'd expect from an Orc battle line, I suppose, he effectively just has the massive infantry deployed in 2 waves with some artillery behind. The numbers of troops that Urglok has access to are so vast, and especially in the second wave, which is a much larger wave of infantry, they're so vast they just fill the valley. So it's therefore quite difficult to discern whether there is a structure or a plan going on in here, because really from above it just looks like a teeming mass of bodies rather than lots of distinct units. Urglok's front wave does sit a little way in front of the main force. It seems to be acting as a particularly eager vanguard to kind of test out Sigmar's defences, see if it can find any weak spots. And Urglok himself, he actually soars above the battlefield on his wyvern, so he has the best view of anyone on the battle. He's able to see the battle from on high and observe the movement of troops on both sides. And he's deployed his braver and kind of more sneaky goblin forces, those that are riding the wolves and spiders, on the valley sides, really aiming to do battle with Sigmar skirmishers and see if they can seek some kind of advantage in the battle, see if they can break through and get behind. Now, before we actually go into the battle itself, it's really important to note that the precise numbers of troops on both sides are not well known. As we all know, histories tend to exaggerate the numbers present for dramatic effect, meaning we must treat all of this with a pinch of salt. But it is said that the Greenskin forces number somewhere over 100,000 bodies, with Sigmar's forces reported to be in maybe the tens of thousands. As such, it's likely that the human and dwarf forces were outnumbered at least 2 to 1, if not significantly more. So the battle itself. The battle begins, as we might have expected, with the Thuringian berserkers charging headlong into the Orc vanguard, which seems equally keen to get stuck in. Now, King Otwin, he comes out well here. He's particularly ferocious at this point. And there are reports at one point where he's seen stood atop a literal mound of Orc bodies just laying into greenskins all around him. The Thuringian berserkers, they're actually so successful at this point that they drive such a deep wedge into the Orc vanguard that inadvertently the Orcs are able to completely surround them. And when this happens, it threatens to turn that initial engagement in front of the 2 main forces into a total wipeout of the Thuringians. So Sigmar orders Queen Freya and her chariots into support. Her charioteers, they unleash volley upon volley of arrows into the Orcs surrounding the Thuringians, before using their pretty horrific bladed wheels to cut along the back of the Orc vanguard, cleaving between them and the main Orc force. And though this is all timed perfectly with Sigmar's first heavy cavalry charge of the day, where his new couched lances cause utter devastation amongst the Orc vanguard. This buys the relief the Thuringians need, allowing what's left of the berserkers to return to the allied lines, and actually effectively between those 3 forces completely annihilates that first Orc wave, which for Sigmar's forces is a resounding victory for the very first moments of the battle. But there's no time for celebration, however, as the main Orc force now advances en masse on the allied lines. a huge contingent of orc boar chariots careens out of the front lines of the orcs and slams into Sigmar's right flank. Now, if you remember, this is where the Burgundians, the Merregans, and the Menegoths are stationed. Eventually, the human forces they're able to bring the chariots down. Some of them are killed with arrow fire in advance of hitting the lines, and the others are eventually surrounded once they dive deep into the human forces and are cut down like that. But this has the desired effect that Urgluk wants to have, completely disrupting Sigmar's right flank, which means that they're unable to reform properly as the orc infantry advances closer. Urgluk, he's not stupid, he senses an advantage here and adds to this confusion by turning the focus of all of his ranged and artillery weapons onto that right flank, causing even more chaos amongst these troops as dozens are crushed under boulders and arrow fire that comes into them. King Kurgan of the Dwarves notices an issue and is able to send a small contingent of his dwarves to try and plug the gaps in the line just in a nick of time, because shortly after the orc infantry charge strikes home. This charge happens across the entire width of the valley, so it's 2 miles wide of orc charge, hits the allied forces, and it's said that within a couple of minutes of this part of the battle, the entire front rank of both forces was almost annihilated as the two armies just crashed together. Now, this is the point where it really does start to go a bit wrong for Sigmar and his allies. Urgluk is just continuing to focus on that right flank. He's urging his orcs to fight harder and harder. And through a combination of that initial charge by the infantry into a series of human formations that just aren't quite ready for them, the ongoing assailment of concentrated ranged attacks, and then a sudden attack from wolf riders on the flank that have broken through Sigmar's skirmishing units on the valley sides, the Menegoth infantry, they finally break and flee. Now this changes the whole focus of the battle. There's now a hole in the allied lines that are allowing orcs to pour through and begin to outflank the forces who had stood adjacent to the Menegoths. And that's the Burgundians and the unfortunate Merregan spearmen. Sigmar sees this, he sees it happen, and he realises he needs to act. And again, his Unberogan heavy cavalry come to the rescue here. He charges the orcs which are outflanking the Merregan spearmen and pushes them back. Now, we had hoped, and I think Sigmar had hoped, that his Unberogan cavalry wouldn't necessarily succumb to the same berserker instincts that King Otwin and his Thuringians tend to suffer with. He's trying to instill a lot more discipline into his tribe's lines, control over the forces during the battle, but I think ultimately their base nature takes over here. His forces see the orcs fall back, and actually Sigmar sees the orcs fall back as well, and this causes his cavalry to push forward into their lines, and actually causes the Unberogan cavalry to overextend and find themselves in exactly the same position as King Otwin did earlier in the battle. Sigmar and his cavalry are completely surrounded, and his men start being dragged from their horses and cut down. Sigmar at this point can't even focus on the wider battle because he himself is trapped in a pretty desperate duel with a huge stone troll that really does threaten to overcome him. Luckily, further back in the allied lines, King Marbad of the Endals has remembered one of the prophecies of the hag woman of the Brackenwalsh, and remembering this was able to kind of preempt what was about to happen with Sigmar and his cavalry, and is able to ride to Sigmar's aid. His raven helms, which are the name of his own cavalry, his elite cavalry, they carve a path through the orcs and give the Unberogans an opportunity to withdraw. This is not without cost, however, and this is something that the prophecy had told King Marbad was going to happen. So he knew this was going to happen when he made this attempt to save Sigmar. King Marbad himself is struck down after leaving himself weaponless by throwing that magic elven sword we talked about, Ulfshard, to Sigmar to use to kill the troll that was threatening to overwhelm him. So returning to his lines with King Marbad's body, Sigmar realizes the allies in his army do not have sufficient numbers to fight this as a simple pitched battle against the orcs. He's been able to plug that right flank, but they can only patch gaps in their lines with reserve forces for so long. And soon, eventually, the simple arithmetic of war is going to tell. Eventually, the orcs, who massively outnumber him, are going to overwhelm him and his army is going to collapse. So he needs to try and change the situation here. But with that being said, I'm not really sure how this thought process concludes with the decision that Sigmar then makes. But I guess that's one of the probably many reasons why I'm not considered by the people of Essex here to be a god of war. So Sigmar decides to climb on top of the Eagle's Nest watchtower that sits within his lines and just jump. He leaps over his own battle line right into the centre of the mass of orcs in the centre of the battle, carrying just his warhammer Galmaraz in hand. He crashes into the middle of the orc horde and just starts laying about him with Galmaraz, crushing any orc that gets too close. It appears somehow the shock of this tactic and the ferocity of Sigmar's attack is enough to cause some disruption to the orc forces in the centre of the lines here. Orcs flee from Galmaraz and they flee from Sigmar, trying to get away from that hammer as it's spinning round. This eventually just opens up a circle of clear space in the battlefield around Sigmar, which I think is what Sigmar is going for, because Urgluk, flying above the battlefield, can't help but notice this, and he sees the disruption that Sigmar has caused and just swoops down into the battle on his wyvern. This is the first time that Urgluk commits actually to the fight. He goads the wyvern to attempt to just devour Sigmar, but soon finds himself standing on his own 2 feet as Galmaraz ends his mount's life in a particularly brutal fashion. Actually finds an existing blade that's stuck into the wyvern's chest, and he uses Galmaraz just to hammer the blade further into the wyvern's chest and into its heart. Urgluk and Sigmar then fight a titanic duel that none who saw it will ever forget. It's a duel that somehow, despite all the wounds he's suffered, despite the fact he's been fighting all day, Sigmar comes out on top of. Galmaraz crushes Urgluk's skull just as the last of Sigmar's strength fades and he collapses to the ground. Before the orcs that surround them can finish Sigmar, the surviving kings and queens of the human tribes fight their way to Sigmar to protect him. With their warboss dead, the orcs soon fall to squabbling and infighting, becoming easy prey for the vengeful allies. Tens of thousands of orcs are slaughtered over the rest of the day until night falls and darkness prevents further pursuit. Thus did Sigmar emerge from his first battle at the head of the united tribes. The Battle of Blackfire Pass is declared a resounding victory for the forces of men and dwarves, and goes down in history as a seminal moment for the people of the tribes of men. The outcome of this battle forges the strong relationship between men and dwarves that lasts into the future, cementing the ties of friendship and earning humans a new level of respect among the Dawi. The kings of the human tribes that were present at the battle decide to formally submit to Sigmar as their emperor, beginning the empire of man that we know today. And finally, King Kurgan instructs his runesmith Alaric to forge the 12 rune-fang swords that are wielded by the Elector Counts to this day. We'll end with an extract from the legend of Sigmar. Quote, "Dwarfs came From Kurgan, High King of the Dwarves, whose hall is Karak, a noble messenger, Alaric the Runesmith, from the far Black Mountains, who braved the Blackfire Pass, where goblins uncounted and black orcs eager for the slaughter besieged the dwarf holds. Sigmar Hammerholder shall come and fight beside his friend. Goblins shall not stand between us, men and dwarfs. In Blackfire Pass, men fought the foe, cut a swath through the horde, met the dwarfs and embraced them, brothers in battle. Sigmar held an hammer and Kurgan the king, the hammer of the goblins and the anvil of the dwarfs.
Thank you for watching, and thank you to all of the YouTube members who are supporting the channel. Special thanks go to Mechanite and Morpheus Gaming, the 2 Grail Knight tier supporters, but thank you as well to everyone else up on the screen now. If you haven't already, there should be a link to subscribe down in the bottom corner there, and if you want to, there is another video coming up on the left for you as well. See you next time.